Nobody in town had seen Walter Hale's face in 4 years. He did his trading through a hired boy and never came to church. I only knew what he looked like because my fence line touched his, and even I hadn't seen him in 2 winters until the night his barn caught fire. I ran to help because that's what you do when a neighbor's barn is burning, regardless of what the town says about the man inside. I found him pulling his horses out through smoke, and when he turned toward me to shout a warning, I saw, for the first time in 4 years, exactly why Walter Hale had stopped letting anyone look at him. It was not what 4 years of rumor had prepared me for. My name is Margaret Cole. I have lived on the section adjoining the Hale place for 11 years, since my husband Robert and I filed the claim in 1870 and built a life on this Colorado ground that has, in the years since, required me to bury Robert, raise 4 children largely alone, and develop the particular unflappable quality that a widow acquires when the alternative to unflappable is not survivable. I am 52 years old. I have seen enough of what this territory can do to a person that I have stopped being easily shocked, which is a useful quality, and also a quality that can make a person incurious about things they have already decided they understand. I had decided, along with the rest of the county, that I understood Walter Hale. I should say something about my own circumstances, because they shaped how I approached what happened. Robert had died in 1876, 5 years before the fire, of a lung ailment that took most of a winter to finish its work. I had 4 children at the time, the youngest 9, and I had done what widows on this land generally do, kept the property, kept the children fed and eventually raised, and developed a particular relationship with solitude that was neither comfortable nor unbearable, simply a fact of the arrangement I had inherited. By 1881, my children were grown and mostly gone, 2 to Denver, 1 to Wyoming, 1 still nearby but married with her own household, and I lived alone on the section, managing 60 acres and a small herd with the same practical competence I had applied to everything since Robert's death. I mention this because it matters for understanding why I did not immediately dismiss Walter's isolation as strange. I understood something about a life reorganized around loss and around managing what other people expect of your grief. I had simply organized mine around forward motion rather than withdrawal, and I had assumed, without much examination, that this made my approach the reasonable one and his the aberration. The rumors had accumulated over 4 years the way rumors do in a place with more time than information. Slowly, and then all at once, taking on a solidity that made them feel like fact regardless of their actual evidentiary basis. Some said he had been disfigured in a mining accident and could not bear to be seen. Some said it was a woman, a broken engagement, a public humiliation. The most persistent rumor, and the one I am ashamed to say I gave the most credit to, was that there was nothing wrong with his face at all, and that the hiding was itself the sickness, a man whose mind had turned inward and strange. I want to be honest about my own participation in this. I had lived beside Walter Hale for 7 years before the withdrawal began, and I had known him, in those years, as a decent neighbor, helpful with a difficult calving, prompt about fence repairs, a man who kept his word. When the withdrawal started, 4 years ago, I had extended him the courtesy of not prying, which I told myself was respect for his privacy, and which I understand now was also, in part, a kind of relief at not having to solve a complicated problem I had no immediate stake in. His hired boy, Petey, was close-mouthed about his employer's business in the specific way of someone paid well to be close-mouthed. Doc Hensley, who I knew had treated Walter for something in the aftermath of whatever had happened, said nothing at all, which told me the situation was serious but told me nothing about its nature. The fence line between our properties required maintenance twice a year, and for 4 years this had been conducted by proxy, Petey handling Walter's side, occasional notes exchanged. I had not seen Walter Hale's face since the autumn of 1877. The fire happened in October of 1881, on a Thursday night with a hard wind coming down off the mountains, the kind of wind that turns a small accident into a serious one within minutes. I was in my kitchen when I smelled the smoke, sharper and closer than usual autumn burning, and I went to my window and saw the orange glow above the tree line in the direction of the Hale barn. I did not deliberate. A neighbor's barn on fire in high wind is a threat to everyone's stock if it spreads, and beyond the practical danger, it is simply what you respond to. I took my coat and my lantern and rode the mile between our properties as fast as the dark allowed. The barn was well involved by the time I arrived. Flame through the roof on the north end, smoke pouring from every gap, the particular roar that a structure fire makes that you feel in your chest before you register it as sound. Walter was at the barn doors, alone, working to get his horses clear. There was no one else there. Petey, I learned later, had been in town that evening. I did not think about his face. I thought about the horses, and about whether one man alone could manage 4 panicked animals, and about the fact that I had handled frightened stock before. I went in with him. We got 3 horses clear together, Walter working the halters with the calm competence of a man who has handled emergencies before, me working the doors and lead lines. The 4th horse, the most panicked, required both of us, and it was in the process of getting that animal through the smoke that Walter turned to shout a warning about a falling beam, and the firelight caught his face fully for the first time in 4 years, from someone who was actually looking. The left side of his face and neck bore extensive burn scarring, old, fully healed, but significant. His right side, in contrast, was entirely unmarked, strong-jawed, deep brown eyes, a face that would once have been, by any standard, a handsome one. I registered all of this in perhaps 2 seconds, in the middle of pulling a panicked horse through smoke with a beam coming down, which turned out to be exactly the right circumstance for forming an honest reaction, because there was no time to perform any particular one. I simply saw him, fully, and I kept working, because the horse still needed to get out and the barn was still on fire. We got the 4th horse clear. We got ourselves clear as the roof came down behind us. We stood in the yard, breathing hard, watching the structure burn past saving. And it was only then that Walter turned his head, instinctively, the old habit, to put his unmarked side toward me. I said, "Don't do that on my account." He looked at me. In the firelight, his expression was difficult to read, though I would learn later that reading Walter Hale's expressions was a skill that took time regardless of lighting conditions. He said, "You've never seen it properly." I said, "I'm seeing it now. It's a burn scar. I've seen burn scars. My own father had one on his forearm from a stove fire when I was a girl." He said, "This is considerably more than a forearm." I said, "I'm aware of the scale, Walter. I was standing next to you in a burning barn 20 minutes ago. Your face is not currently at the top of my list of concerns tonight." This was entirely true. I had spent the previous 20 minutes concerned with fire and panicked livestock and structural collapse. His face, whatever its condition, had simply not registered as a crisis requiring my emotional attention, because there were more immediate crises actively occurring. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The town has theories." I said, "The town has a great many theories about a great many things. I've found most of them to be more interesting than accurate." He said, "What did you think it was?" I considered whether to be honest. I decided honesty was owed. I said, "I didn't know." I told myself it wasn't my business to speculate, and mostly I kept that promise, though I'll admit some of what circulated through town reached me regardless. He said, "And now that you know," I said, "now I know you were in a fire, a bad one by the look of it. I know Doc Hensley treated you for something serious enough to require ongoing discretion. I know you decided 4 years ago that the world was better managed from behind a fence than in front of one, and I have some understanding, now, of why that decision might have felt reasonable at the time." He said, "And does it still seem reasonable to you?" I looked at him, really looked, in a way I had not allowed myself to look at anyone in some years, because looking at people carefully is its own kind of vulnerability, and I had, since Robert died, generally avoided situations that required it. I said, "I think 4 years is a long time to spend managing other people's imagined reactions instead of your actual life." He was quiet for a long moment. The barn continued its slow collapse behind us, embers rising into the October dark. He said, "It wasn't only their reactions I was managing." I waited. He said, "It was easier to assume the worst of how people would respond than to test it and find out I was wrong to hope otherwise. If I never let anyone see it, I never had to watch someone's face change when they did." I sat with this. It was a particular kind of logic that made complete sense from the inside of 4 years of solitude, and that looked, from where I stood, like a trap a careful man had built for himself out of a reasonable fear that had never been tested against reality. I said, "My face hasn't changed." He said, "I noticed." I said, "I imagine that surprised you." He said, "It did. I had prepared for several reactions, yours wasn't among them." We stood in the yard while the barn finished burning, and eventually the immediate work of the night, accounting for the animals, assessing what could be salvaged, waiting for Petey to arrive with the news having reached town, occupied us both, and there was no more discussion of faces or 4 years. But something had shifted. In the weeks that followed, while Walter rebuilt the barn with hired help he could no longer avoid using given the scale of the damage, I found myself at the fence line more often than the maintenance schedule strictly required, and he found himself less inclined to angle away from me when we spoke, and neither of us mentioned this adjustment directly, because some things are better allowed to simply become true than announced. By December, he came to my door instead of waiting for me at the fence. He stood on my porch with his hat in his hands, and both sides of his face visible in the porch lamplight, and he said he'd like to have supper with me if I was amenable, and that he understood if 4 years of his own strange behavior made that an unreasonable request. I said supper was not an unreasonable request from a man who had helped me move a barn's worth of frightened livestock through smoke. I said I had been meaning to invite him for weeks and had been waiting to see if he'd manage it himself first, because I thought the asking mattered to him more than the answer. He said I was probably right about that. We had supper. We had it again the following week, and the week after, and through the winter we developed the particular rhythm of two people who have decided, without extensive discussion, that they intend to keep seeing each other. He told me about the fire eventually, the actual account, not the rumors version. A kerosene lamp knocked over in his own barn 3 years prior to the one that had just burned. An accident during a difficult foaling that had required lamplight at an hour when exhaustion made hands less careful than they should have been. He had gotten the horse out. He had not gotten out quickly enough himself. Doc Hensley had done what could be done, which in 1877 was considerably less than modern medicine would offer, and Walter had spent 4 months healing and had emerged from that healing a man who had decided, in the isolation of his recovery, that the world was safer viewed from behind a fence. I told him about Robert, and about the particular quality of grief that doesn't end but changes shape over years, and about how I had managed my own version of withdrawal by staying busy rather than staying hidden, which I had come to understand were simply 2 different strategies for the same underlying problem. By February, the town of Millbrook had a new subject for its theories, which were considerably more accurate than the previous ones, though I noted they were also considerably less interesting to the people generating them, because a widow and a scarred rancher finding companionship in their 5th decade lacks the particular drama that 4 years of mystery had provided. I did not mind the loss of drama. I had spent 4 years living next to a mystery and had participated, more than I was proud of, in a town's collective failure to simply ask a direct question or extend a basic courtesy of continued regard. What I found, once the mystery resolved into an actual man with an actual history, was considerably better than the story the town had told itself. Walter Hale had hidden his face for 4 years because he believed the reaction he feared was more certain than the reaction he hoped for. I have thought about this often since, about how much of what any of us hide is not the thing itself, but our prediction of how it will be received, and how that prediction, formed in isolation, has a way of hardening into a certainty that no longer resembles the actual range of what people are capable of. We were married in the spring, at the rebuilt barn's first proper use, a modest gathering, Walter's face fully visible to everyone who came, myself included, every day since. He still has moments, occasionally, of the old instinct. A slight turn of the head in a new social situation, a hand that moves toward the collar of his shirt before he catches himself. I have learned to recognize these moments without commenting on them, because some habits take longer to unlearn than 4 years took to build, and my job is not to correct the habit but to be steadily, unremarkably present while it fades on its own schedule. That was the whole of it. That was everything.